They said a man couldn't buy a future for $50. But what if that $50 bought a forgotten piece of land, a second chance, and a moment that would change everything? If you love stories that begin with nothing and rise into something unforgettable, tap that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Because this story doesn't just unfold, it grips you by the heart and refuses to let go. When Ellie Mercer handed over the last crumpled bills in his pocket, he wasn't buying hope. He was buying silence. The kind of silence that lives far from towns, far from memories, far from the echoes of a life that never quite worked out. The auctioneer barely looked at him when the gavel fell. $50 for a stretch of dry ranchland no one wanted anymore. Too rocky, too remote, too cursed by rumor. Eli didn't care. At 38, with a spine worn thin by ranch hand labor and a heart tired of being passed over, he needed somewhere the world would stop asking him who he was supposed to be. He rode out 2 days later with a single horse, a bedroll, and a tin of coffee beans, the land deed folded like a secret in his coat. The ranch sat under a sky so wide it made a man feel either free or very small. The house was a broken thing, one room leaning into another, boards bleached pale by sun and neglect. Eli set down his gear, breathed in dust and sage, and felt, for the first time in years, that no one was watching him fail. As evening crept in, he walked the fence line, touching posts as if greeting old ghosts, imagining a life built slowly, fix the roof, mend the well, maybe raise a few cattle if luck ever wandered his way. The sun slipped behind the hills, painting the land in copper and bruise purple, and that's when he saw the light. 3 figures stood near the old coral fire pit, their silhouettes steady, unmoving, as if they had been waiting not just hours but years. Eli's hand went to his chest, his heart hammering like it wanted to escape. He called out, his voice cracking against the open land, but the wind swallowed his words. When he stepped closer, he saw them clearly, 3 Apache women, their presence calm, eyes sharp, faces unreadable. They weren't trespassers startled by a stranger. They were hosts interrupted by a late arrival. The tallest spoke first, her voice even, grounded. "You bought this land," she said, not a question. Eli nodded, suddenly aware of how foolish he must look, a lonely cowboy clutching a hat like a shield. "We have been here," she continued, "because this place remembers us." The words settled heavy. Eli didn't know what to say. He had come for solitude, not for a reckoning. The second woman stepped forward, older, her hair braided with care, eyes holding stories older than any deed. She told him the land had been Apache ground long before papers and auctions, long before fences tried to teach the earth where to stop. They had come not to fight, but to witness, because whenever a stranger claimed this place, something always changed. Fear crept up I's spine, but it wasn't fear of them. It was fear of being unworthy of what he'd stumbled into. He admitted quietly that he hadn't come to take from anyone. He had come because he had nowhere else. The third woman, youngest, watched him closely as if weighing the truth of his words. Silence stretched, then the tall woman nodded once. "Then you should know," she said. "This land does not belong to those who buy it. It belongs to those who listen." Night deepened around them. Eli offered coffee, hands shaking, and they accepted, sitting by the fire as if this meeting had been written long ago. They spoke of droughts and storms, of families scattered by force and time, of a ranch that had broken every man who tried to own it without respect. Eli listened more than he spoke, feeling something unfamiliar take root, a sense that loneliness wasn't cured by being alone, but by being seen. When the fire burned low, the women stood. The eldest told him they would return, because the land would decide what came next. As they disappeared into the dark, Eli stood there long after, the night alive with questions. He had bought a ranch to disappear. Instead, he had been found, and as he lay on the hard floor of the house, staring at a ceiling full of stars through broken boards, he realized $50 hadn't bought him land at all. It had bought him the beginning of a story that would test his heart, his past, and everything he thought he understood about belonging. If this first chapter pulled you in, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will challenge everything you expect from a lonely cowboy's fate. Morning came softly, as if the land itself were unsure whether Eli deserved a sunrise. Pale light spilled across the ranch, touching the dry grass and broken boards with a gentleness that felt undeserved. Eli woke with the echo of last night still heavy in his chest, half convinced the 3 Apache women had been a dream stitched together by loneliness and exhaustion. But when he stepped outside, he saw the footprints near the fire pit, real, pressed into dust that had not yet forgotten their weight. The land had spoken, and now it was watching to see if he would listen. He spent the morning repairing what he could, hammering loose boards, hauling water from the stubborn well, working until sweat blurred thought. Yet no matter how hard he tried to lose himself in labor, his mind returned to the women's words, to the way they had looked at him not with anger, but with expectation. By noon, a rider appeared at the far edge of the property, a neighbor named Caldwell who laughed when Ely mentioned the visitors. "You saw ghosts," Caldwell said, spitting tobacco. "Or trouble. This land's been empty for a reason." Ely didn't argue. He had learned long ago that truth didn't need defending. That afternoon, clouds gathered without warning, and a dry wind cut across the ranch, carrying with it a low, steady hum, like a song sung too far away to hear the words. Eli followed the sound, drawn past the corral, into a shallow valley where stones rose in strange, deliberate patterns. There, the women waited again. This time they spoke more. They told him of ceremonies once held there, of a promise broken when the land was sold piece by piece, of why every owner before him had fled, because the land demanded acknowledgement, not control. Eli admitted his fears openly, confessed how he had drifted from job to job, town to town, never staying long enough to be remembered, never believing he deserved more. The youngest woman listened intently, her gaze softening. "The land reflects the man," she said. "If you run from yourself, it will chase you away." They asked him to help restore the valley, not as an owner, but as a caretaker, to clear debris, to rebuild the stone circle as it once stood. Eli hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Over the next days they worked side by side. Words were few, but understanding grew in the spaces between them. Eli learned their names: Nalin, the eldest, Taza, the tall speaker, and Shia, the youngest, whose quiet strength surprised him. As his hands shaped stone and earth, something inside him settled. Nights were no longer silent, they were full of stories, laughter low and rare, but real. Yet change rarely comes without resistance. Rumors spread. Caldwell returned with others, men who believed land was owned by force and papers. They warned Eli that he was inviting trouble, that the women would claim everything. Eli stood his ground, voice steady, heart pounding. "This land isn't a prize," he said. "It's a responsibility." Tension cracked the air. When the men left, threats hanging behind them, Eli realized choosing to stay meant choosing a side. The women thanked him, but there was sorrow in their gratitude, as if they knew the cost of standing still in a world that rewards only taking. That night a storm broke, violent and sudden. Rain battered the ranch, lightning splitting the sky. Eli rushed to secure the house, only to see water flooding the valley. Without thinking, he ran toward the stone circle. There, in the downpour, he worked to protect what they had rebuilt, hands bleeding, body shaking. When dawn came, the storm passed, leaving the land changed, greener, softer, alive. The women stood with him, silent, witnessing not the flood, but the choice he had made. For the first time, Eli felt something he had never owned before, a future rooted not in escape, but in purpose. Yet beyond the hills, forces were already moving, unwilling to let such harmony stand. And the land, ancient and patient, waited to see how far Eli would go to prove he belonged. The calm after the storm didn't last. It never does. The land looked renewed, the soil dark and rich, the air carrying a clean, hopeful scent. But beneath that peace ran a tension Eli could feel in his bones. The ranch had noticed him now, so had the people around it. Word traveled fast in empty places, and by the third morning after the storm, riders appeared again at the fence line. This time they didn't come with laughter or warnings. They came with papers. Caldwell stood at the front, his face tight, holding a folded document like a weapon. He claimed the land had been missold, that there were old disputes, unresolved claims, and that Eli's $50 miracle could be erased with a judge's signature. Eli listened quietly, anger and fear twisting together in his chest. He had nothing left to lose, but he had finally found something worth standing for. Taza stepped forward beside him, her presence steady as stone. She spoke calmly, reminding them that long before auctions and deeds, the land had known different names and different caretakers. The men scoffed. History, they said, didn't pay taxes. Ely felt the old instinct rise, the one that told him to step back, to disappear before things turned ugly. He had lived his whole life that way. But then Shia met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw something fragile and powerful: belief. Not in ownership, in him. Ely took the papers from Caldwell's hand, read them slowly, then folded them carefully and returned them. "You can take this to court," he said. "But I'm not leaving. Not like this." The confrontation ended without blood, but the threat lingered like heat before a fire. That night, the women spoke honestly with Ely for the first time about the cost of staying. They told him of families pushed aside, of promises rewritten, of how standing your ground often meant standing alone. Ely admitted he was afraid, not of losing the land, but of failing it. Nalin placed a hand over his, her touch gentle but certain. "Belonging is not granted," she said. "It is chosen again and again." As days passed, Ely began making plans, not to claim the ranch, but to protect it. He filed for shared stewardship, sought legal help in the nearest town, and for the first time in his life, spoke up without apologizing for existing. The work was slow, the resistance was loud, but the land responded. Grass grew thicker, water flowed clearer, and at night, when the fire burned low, Ely realized his loneliness had changed shape. It was no longer an emptiness. It was a quiet space filled with purpose. One evening, Shia walked with him along the ridge as the sun dipped low. She told him she had watched many men come and go, all believing they could tame the land. "You are different," she said. "You let it change you." Ely didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't try. He simply stood there, a man no longer running, watching the horizon stretch endlessly forward. Trouble was still coming, he knew that, but for the first time he wasn't facing it alone. And sometimes that makes all the difference. When the judge ruled shared stewardship, the land felt lighter. Caldwell never returned. Ely stayed, not as an owner, but a guardian. The women continued to visit, teaching him the rhythms of the earth, and loneliness slowly left him. $50 hadn't bought a ranch, it had bought belonging. If this story moved you, like the video and subscribe to the channel, because some stories are meant to be carried forward.